is 3 National News with John Hawksby.
Tonight, John Banks runs headlong into a gay rights fracas. Freedom at last for a war veteran convicted of benefit fraud. And a royal wedding shrouded in tradition and mystery. Good evening. Outrage tonight at an attack on homosexuals by Police Minister John Banks. He says the conviction of Christchurch creche worker Peter Ellis for child molestation sends a clear message to all New Zealanders. Homosexuals must not be given easy access to childcare jobs. His comments have provoked a howl of protest, but John Banks is unrepentant.
The Police Minister's lunchtime run around the Wellington waterfront. Today, John Banks has run into controversy as well. At issue, an amendment to the Human Rights Bill, which will outlaw discrimination against homosexuals.
Don't ask me as a Member of Parliament to come into Parliament like a poodle and lick and rubber stamp their fetishes into law. Don't ask me to do it, because I won't.
Those comments follow the Christchurch creche case. In an exclusive interview with TV3's 2020, convicted creche worker Peter Ellis said he was homosexual.
I feel more comfortable in the company of women, but I seem to end up sleeping with men.
It's time to stand up and say no to these fetishes, no to these liberals, and stand up for what is decent.
John Banks admits homosexuality and pedophilia are different things, but still believes letting homosexuals work with children is too big a risk. Dr. Tony Ward disagrees.
There is no research evidence that suggests that homosexual men or women are more likely to offend against children.
With a PhD on the subject, Tony Ward has extensively profiled adults who sexually abuse children. Few are homosexuals.
I think the thing to keep in mind is pedophilia is not the same, not to be confused with homosexuality. Just as most heterosexuals don't offend against children, most homosexuals don't offend against children.
I don't believe that the issue of sexual orientation, which after all everybody does have, is a relevant issue in terms of whether or not that person's an abuser.
But it's the homosexual community which has been tarred with a brush it feels is entirely inappropriate.
The basic thing you have to understand is that you're talking about paedophilias as regards to something like the child abuse cases. It's completely different to homosexuality.
John Campbell, 3 National News.
An 80-year-old war veteran was freed from jail today after completing a reduced sentence for benefit fraud. While the family of 80-year-old Jack Marker welcome his release, they say he's been treated cruelly by the Department of Social Welfare.
Jack Marker had made it clear he didn't want a lot of fuss, so it was close friends and family who waited for the 80-year-old to come home from jail. A judge reduced Jack's sentence to 6 months after an appeal followed his conviction for illegally claiming double social welfare benefits. Offset against half-term release provisions, the war veteran came home today. Mr. Marker, are you happy to be home?
Yeah, yes.
You're happy to be back with your family?
Yes.
Jack Marker may be free, but his family's still furious, saying he's been dealt a cruel and inhumane blow by uncaring and malicious welfare officers.
At 80 or, you know, even 70, it don't really matter, 60. They looked into it more carefully. It would have been better off for Dad. You know, there's a lot of young ones doing it, you know.
Do you feel he was just hauled into court without any sort of real sympathetic investigation on their part?
Yes, he was. That's one thing I know definitely he was.
Mr. Marker's lawyer, Honoria Gray, says her client has options open to him but wouldn't elaborate. Son Tony says his father's innocent.
I believe that he might have been used as a, like a pawn sort of thing and pushed around. But unfortunately, him being an 80-year-old man, he's not a white-collar crime. You know, it's got nothing to do with that. I believe that, unfortunately, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that was all.
Relatives deny Jack Marker's to undergo psychiatric examination. The Marker family will now spend the next few weeks getting to know their father all over again. In the meantime, they're examining what legal options, if any, are open to them to do the best to clear their father's name. Scott Mathias, 3 National News.
The head of the Conservation Department's Ethics Committee has resigned in protest at the Kaimanawa Horse Roundup. Neil Wells claims the roundup was legally defined as a research project and his committee should have been consulted. It wasn't, and he's quit.
220 horses rounded up, some of them destined for human consumption in Europe. The Conservation Department says the roundup was a trial run that could lead to another 800 horses being captured. Animal welfare groups have protested hotly, but by far the biggest blow to the Conservation Department's plans came today, when the head of DOC's Ethics Committee announced on Radio Pacific he was stepping down.
Up to an hour ago, you were the chairman of the DOC's Ethics Committee. You have just resigned. Why?
Yes, I have. This issue has been... I believe that under the department's own Code of Ethical Conduct, that there was a requirement to have this procedure considered and approved by the Ethics Committee. The Director General has disagreed. He considers that my opinion is wrong. I still maintain I'm right, and we really reached a position where I had no alternative than to resign from the committee.
Some Kaimanawa locals have also taken issue with the muster, claiming the army does more environmental damage with its tanks than the horses, and one Maori leader is considering legal action under the Waitangi Tribunal to protect the herd, which dates back to the 1860 land wars. The total number of wild horses before the muster began was estimated at 2,000. The department wants to cut numbers back to half that level, but the cull has its supporters. The Veterinary Association says this week's roundup was humane and did not unduly stress or injure the animals. Ian Wishart, 3 National News.
Prime Minister Jim Bolger has delivered a stinging rebuff to the United States with his strongest statements yet on the anti-nuclear legislation. He's telling the Americans the nuclear-free standoff has gone on too long, but at the same time, he appears to be ruling out a policy U-turn by New Zealand.
If the government was wavering in the face of US pressure, the Prime Minister's given the clearest sign anti-nuclear is here to stay. He's told the American Chamber of Commerce in Wellington that the nuclear policy is not intended as an affront to our American allies, but as a democratic expression of New Zealanders' respect for their environment. The standoff has gone on too long. It's time for a thaw.
On the security issue, there are clear differences. I don't bring any solution that's magical. If we're there talking together, maybe a solution emerges. But clearly, any solution has to include the democratic decision of New Zealanders to be non-nuclear.
The Clinton administration has maintained the ball is in New Zealand's court to resolve the 8-year standoff.
Unless there's movement by New Zealand on that question, I don't see how we can do that.
But Bolger's statements are the strongest indication yet the policy won't be tampered with, despite last year's nuclear safety review, seen as a softener for change. It'll also force a different tack from Foreign Affairs Minister Don McKinnon, whose visits to Washington were widely seen as part of the softening process. But Bolger can't do a U-turn without losing all credibility with voters, and that's overjoyed the peace movement.
After this long process of Don McKinnon trying to change the public's minds and the whole nuclear review, for him to say this now, I really do believe means they've settled it, and everyone should feel very proud of that in New Zealand.
There's no ambassador in residence here. Bill Clinton is yet to appoint one, but the incoming diplomat will have a clear message. Nuclear-free won't be changed by this government. Steve Christensen, 3 National News.
The bride wore a traditional wedding kimono, her body purified according to Shinto rites. Today, Japan received a new princess, an educated, westernised woman who surprised many by joining a royal family steeped in tradition.
Masako Owada made the transition to royalty with exquisite formality. Only invited guests were present, the cameras of a media mobilisation without precedent seeing little of the ceremony. Crown Prince Naruhito, now aged 33, had failed to meet his target of finding a bride by his 30th birthday. The 29-year-old commoner needed to be persuaded to give up a career as a diplomat to join the world's oldest surviving royal family. It's said Empress Michiko persuaded Masako to marry her son.
The imperial family headhunted her as the best diplomat in Japan.
The bride's day began early, when she left her parents' home for the last time, for a new home at the moated and walled palace in the centre of Tokyo. In steady rain, the 800 guests and official party arrived at the most sacred shrine in Japan, dedicated to the sun goddess. Inside, with an unseen sip of sacred sake, Masako became a princess. It's the culmination of a national love story. In the streets, television sets relayed the public parts of the ceremony, and court commentators described what the viewers weren't allowed to see. Inside the shrine, wearing a 14-kilogram cocoon of kimono of 12 layers of silk, Masako Owada lost her family name, her right to vote, and most of her other civil rights. Surrounded by the secrecy that will claim her for the rest of her life, she became Crown Princess Masako, wife to the heir of the 1,500-year-old chrysanthemum throne. John Hale, 3 National News.
In the news ahead, plumbing the depths of a Christchurch sewer, a lavatory-loving rat on the rampage, and one of England's landed gentry finds he's not above the law.
Tonight, John Banks goes on another anti-gay crusade and the gays come out in the studio. And the chrysanthemum bride, a role model for modern Japanese women, steps back into centuries of ritual and sacrifice.